Happy New Year and welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the energy future and how the oil and gas industry will lead. I'm Tisha Schuller. I'm your host, and I'm also the CEO of Adamantine Energy. I am doing another solo podcast. Thank you for your feedback on the last one. It seems like thinking out loud together is something that was mutually beneficial. So we're going to do that again. And working on this, I'm coffeed up. I had my morning swim, but kind of the whole point is I don't exactly know what I'm going to say. So I have some inspirations for the topic today, and I'm hoping that they'll hold together with something of a consistent theme. And all of this is in service to working on my next book, which is The Moment. And The Moment is about forces conspiring to lay bare the challenges of the energy transition, that it's not going to be quick and easy. And so I am still thinking through, working out how this creates opportunities for the oil and gas industry to have a seat at the table and to provide civic leadership. And that is central to everything we'll talk about today. So a couple of things that happened. I'm recording this in December, and so I'll talk to you a little bit about some things that happened here at the end of the year. And then in the intervening time between when I'm recording this and you hear this, I'm going to go to Nicaragua and hopefully come back with some fresh hot takes on the things that we're working on together as well. So stay tuned for more about that. So a couple of things that happened at the end of the year. I interviewed my last podcast interview with Matt Iglesias. If you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend it. We talk a lot about, he is a commentator on the left. He has a Substack called Slow Boring that I strongly recommend that you subscribe to. And he really challenges, well, everyone's thinking. He challenges my thinking. He challenges sort of in-group democratic thinking. And that has me thinking a lot about, it's easy for us to sit around and say, this is what people who care about climate should think about differently about oil and gas. But what does it mean for us? What do we need to think about differently? What would be the critique of our own work? And so that is a theme of this effort today. Two other things happened, interestingly, in the New York Times. I do subscribe to the New York Times and I do read it every day because I think it's really important to understand a lot of the way the world thinks about energy and climate, whether or not I often agree with their perspectives. So two interesting things happened in December. One, I was interviewed for more than a half hour by a climate reporter who wrote a piece on Chris Wright, nominee for Secretary of Energy. I know him well, and Chris makes a passionate case for the role of oil and gas in addressing energy for development, energy around the world. And I also write on this topic, and I also sit on the board of the Energy for Growth Hub. So it's an area of shared interest. And we'll talk a little bit how that story missed the mark missed the opportunity to talk about climate and energy and development in important ways. But I wanted to not just think about the ways in which the New York Times reporter caricatured fossils and oil and gas and their role. We can talk about that. But how do we resist doing the same thing in reverse? How do we resist the urge to caricature others in a way that undermines our ability to make progress on these issues? I think that's really important. And the second thing that happened in the New York Times in December is there was an opinion piece by Arnab Datta. He has been on this podcast in the past, and he actually will be in the podcast in January as well. And he wrote a piece about how Democrats need to talk and think about climate differently, which I fully support and enthusiastically embrace. And again, what's the corollary? What does it mean for us? Easy to sit around and point fingers at others. What's the opportunity for us to think about these things? Because I think a lot of the critiques levied at maybe the excesses or the black and white thinking of sort of traditional environmental and climate advocacy, I'm not so sure that those critiques can't be levied at us or even me in the way I talk about it. So I'm really thinking about how to turn those tables into self-reflection and think about how to be more effective at the work we do. So that leads me to my first topic for today. I wanted to opine a bit, think about the difference between telling the truth and diplomacy. So critiques of my work at Energy Thinks and my weekly newsletter, both of these things are true. Please subscribe on Substack, is that I sugarcoat it, that I provide cover to maybe activists, or essentially that I don't tell the truth, that there's this idea of telling the truth and this idea of not telling the truth. And of course, I wrote the 3 T's of energy realism, which has at its heart telling the truth. So I thought it'd be worth thinking about, like, what are the nuances between maybe a more vociferous advocate of, am I using that word correctly? Vociferous advocate for the oil and gas industry, what they would consider telling the truth and why they would think I'm not telling the truth. I think the difference lies in either your theory of how to be effective or in your audience. So if you go to an oil and gas conference and you talk about the critical role of oil and gas for the next, pick your number, 10, 20, or 50 years. And these are all the things you could use for. That's going to meet a receptive audience. And so there's no question about whether or not you can or should just lay that out. But if you went to a Environmental 101 course on the University of Colorado at Boulder campus, which I've done, and been a guest speaker, and you laid out the same information and you decided that telling the truth was the key, I'm going to tell them what matters. If you came from the oil and gas industry, you would just be dismissed outright by a bunch of 18, 19, or 20-year-olds as a shill for the industry, as someone speaking in their own self-interest. And so the same information is effective in one arena and ineffective in another. So, of course, my approach more broadly, which I like to think of as diplomatic, is to think about what the world looks like to the audience. What is the paradigm in which they live? What is the way in which they think about these topics? And is there a point of entry? Is there a point of commonality? Is there some curiosity or way to get in and present the same information, but present it in a way that is more compelling? And I found myself doing this in my interview with the New York Times reporter, because I'll talk about that article a little more in a minute. But as you can imagine, the questions like, is it true that you need fossil fuels to move an economy from developing to middle class? And the truth is, yes, it is true that in many, many, many cases, in most cases, you're going to need some form of fossil fuels. But that's just going to play to part in that interview. Instead, I said that, how you think about this depends on where you begin thinking about the world. And many climate advocates think of the world as starting with a finite carbon budget and moving backwards. And if that's how you think about the world, there is 100 chips and 86 of them have been used and we have 14 left. More or less, nobody gets those chips, right? That's how you think about the world. So then you have to start from that perspective and convey. In that worldview, you have to make a very compelling case for the trade-offs of using fossil fuels, for example, to help an economy develop. And you can make a lot of headway in these conversations if you start from the way that your audience or your conversation partner thinks about the world. And 2 things I think that can be really useful in being an effective communicator of truth, but in a diplomatic fashion. 2 really effective tools are, 1, ask questions. If you don't know what the world looks like to them, ask. How do you think about these things? Not to correct, but to understand and to look for interesting ways to enter their view of the world, their paradigm of the world, and talk about what's important to you in their context, which looks really, really, really different. That is one thing, is ask questions. And then the second way is to hold your view of the world very lightly and imagine if you shared their view of the world, what would you think? And it's actually fairly easy for me to slip on the shoes of someone who believes that there's a finite carbon budget and think, well, obviously nobody gets any more carbon. I can actually relate to that perspective. And then whether I stay there or not depends on the quality of the conversation that I have, right? And so having a kind of empathy or flexibility to enter the worldview of another, that's not lying. That's not telling the truth. That's not being courageous. It's actually being, I think, mentally agile and understanding that being effective in conversation, being effective in conveying our view of the world requires something different than just telling the truth or spouting facts or saying things over and over and over. And at its heart, I always come back to this idea of, do you like it when someone tries to change your mind? No, you don't. No, None of us do. And so if we want to be effective, we really need to think about these things. Okay. So telling the truth versus diplomacy. I think I wandered through that and reinforced my thinking that sometimes I wonder if I do lack courage, that I'm not just out there telling the truth, but I think it's because I just don't have any interest in wasting time. The work we have to do as an industry is so vast. There's just so many people that we need to engage with in different ways, and just telling them the truth, quote unquote, is not effective. Understanding the way they view the world and then entering the world in a way that shares their aspiration or shares their point of view gives us, I think, new insights into how to be effective in our work. Okay, so that was the first topic. The second topic I'm thinking about is, how do you give your conversation partner an out? Okay, so let's say you're wildly effective. Let's say, either way, let's say you told the truth. You told people how it is. You explained how the world actually works. And they were like, whoa, you're right. How do you let that conversation partner or that classroom full of 18-year-olds at your Environmental 101 lecture, how do you let them leave with their intellect and their dignity intact? What is the off-ramp? What is the way they can reconcile how they walked into a conversation with you and how they walked out? And I want to really stress that this should not be undervalued. If you want to evolve people's thinking, if you want to change the course of a conversation, ponder how that person leaves with their intellectual or identity or emotional dignity intact. Otherwise, your ideas aren't going to stick, because we are all quite sensitive creatures, especially when it comes to our moral high ground or our intellectual high ground. And so I think a way, for example, that you could do this, let's just stay on the topic of energy for development. I have had many conversations with people that say developing economies do not need oil and gas to develop. And one of the ways that I can create an off-ramp is by saying a really important consideration is that no economy has modernized without industrializing. And there is just a misperception out there that a country can go from, basically like subsistence agriculture, say, to like cell phones and spas. And in fact, along the way, somebody has to manufacture and build the cell phones and the spas for that matter, and the massage tables for that matter. And so industrialization is a key element, and industrialization cannot happen without always on scalable energy, for which at this moment, other than hydro or nuclear, there are not fossil-free components. And so it is reasonable for your average person to not have thought about industrialization as a key component and fossils as a component of industrialization. And so you're giving room. There's an off-ramp. Oh, new information. Oh, new considerations. So I think that's an important element of this idea of engaging with people in a way that you want to evolve their thinking. And again, the cautious note is, what's the difference between educating someone and engaging for the evolution of their thinking? The difference is that you too have to participate in a way that can be engaged. If you have all the answers, if you are 100% right on everything, you're not that interesting of a conversation partner, right? You're just annoying. So I know I resemble that remark. So one of the things that we can commit to in going into these kinds of endeavors is to also evolve our thinking, even if the only thing that we are evolving is our understanding of how people think about things, where they get their information, what makes them edgy, what makes them angry. Like, we can evolve our thinking about these things. So give your conversation partners an exit ramp and think about what that looks like. And that takes practice. It really does. The third thing that I want to think about is this idea of the inevitable rise of practical environmentalism. So in the Iglesias podcast, I re-listened to that this morning, just trying to think about what I could learn about the way I do my work. So we're kind of talking a lot about, maybe the left or the center left in that conversation, but it does apply to work in the industry or work on the right or the center right. So what's required of us if there is going to be a rise of center left groups that want to work pragmatically? There's like a bigger tent for decarbonization conversation on the energy future, and oil and gas is invited. The tent doors are open and we are invited. What is required of us? How do we need to prepare now, and how do we need to show up? So one element I think is important. There's three things I think are going to be important. And one is that we tell the truth that is inconvenient to the industry. So for an example would be, yes, there are people in the oil and gas industry who are not interested in addressing climate. I have a really hard time saying that out loud because I don't want to play to stereotypes. And so I get kind of edgy. But actually, we need to be willing to talk about the less convenient elements of the industry because it's true and because it's important to be credible partners, which means we have to have the courage to have some in-group critique. We have to be willing to critique poor actors in our industry. We need to be willing to critique positions we don't agree with in our industry. And we need to have the courage to do so. It is a weird thing that when you work in the oil and gas industry, especially if you live in a blue state like I do, you feel so defensive because you have to sort of narrate your work. Like I have to narrate my work all the time. What do you do? I work in energy. Oh, like renewables? Well, the traditional fields. Oh, why do you do that? And I think many of you have had that experience. And so then you feel under attack. So you don't want to critique your own people, your own family. But I think we have to actually to be credible and to make progress. And if we want to create this big pragmatic center space, we have to do what we're asking of pragmatic environmental organizations, pragmatic think tanks, pragmatic academics. We're asking them to be courageous. We also need to be courageous. So that brings me back to the New York Times story on Chris Wright and his position on energy for developing economies. Okay, that story was a bummer. It essentially characterized energy for development as black or white. You either are pro-fossils, and those are caricatured as like the same old tired arguments, we've been hearing for 40 years, or you don't need any fossils. And the absence of nuance, the absence of just that there could be a middle way was so interesting. And the thing I want to take away from that is just an understanding that all or nothing, black or white thinking is exactly what makes me, maybe us, the industry, defensive. And interestingly, black and white thinking begets a black and white response. So I'm challenging myself, and I would invite you to join me, to reject caricatures of ourselves, but reject caricatures of activists, of perhaps even in that story, like my comment in that story was innocuous enough, but it certainly didn't reflect the 30 minutes of, I will just say brilliant and insightful things that I wanted to convey to this New York Times reporter. And maybe the others, maybe those who essentially sounded like they were saying down with fossil fuels, renewables only forever, maybe also their nuance was lost. So I'm not going to assume anything about them. And I'm not going to even assume anything about the author of the article because maybe that all happened in editing, right? So if we want nuanced conversations about complexity, about trade-offs, about time frame, we just can't participate in black and white nonsensical thinking. And one motivation for that, in that story, there is a villain. I mean, I'd like to think the villain isn't, Energy of Secretary nominee Chris Wright, because he is a lovely human being. Maybe the villain is oil and gas, or people who support fossils, or, the former CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. I don't know who the villain is, but there certainly were good guys and bad guys. And why? Why do we have to be the bad guys? I don't know. But I think if you engage in black and white thinking, there's always a bad guy. So this inspires me to reject oversimplistic narratives where there's a bad guy, including ones that serve my interests. So that's my takeaway for today. I would like to flag for your attention something that happened in October as a departing inspiration. Darren Woods, CEO of ExxonMobil, was interviewed by Bloomberg at COP. And I don't know how much traction. That's a podcast that I don't even listen to because I just find it kind of, annoying. The Bloomberg Green Energy podcast. But I did listen to that one, and Darren Woods was terrific. He was clear. He had a broad range of information, and he did not get defensive or combative at all, and yet he gave no ground. There was some really nice modeling of how to engage in, I think, diplomatic truth-telling. There were shared aspirations. There was an understanding of climate as a priority. So there was some paradigm merging. And I just thought it was a terrific example of how we can engage in ways that are honest and truthful, interesting, nuanced, but not angry. Not, quote unquote, telling the truth. So listen to that. I'll link to it in the show note. And I'm going to wrap it up for today. Happy New Year. And I hope that this will kick off your thinking for how you want to engage in this work of the energy future together. What is the stance that you're going to take around how you engage, how you think, how you build bridges? Because ultimately, the civic leadership requires there to be a seat for us at the table, but it requires that we be ready to sit in it and participate as civic leaders. Thanks for listening to Energy Thinks. I would love it if in the new year, your little baby gift to me was to give Energy Thinks a 5-star rating. Wherever you listen to your podcast, it helps other people in the industry find us. If you would like to know more about our work at Adamantine, please check out energythinks.com. I hope while you are there, you will sign up for my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'm focusing on growing that following on Substack, so please do that while you're there. And in the show notes, you'll see some cool things to listen to, but I'll also put another link to Matt Iglesias's Slow Boring Substack, because I just cannot recommend that highly enough. And thank you to Kayla Chives for making the Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.